So last week was fellowship.
Jesus Christ.
Hello and welcome to A God We Could Believe In, a frank and honest look at Christianity as we find it today. We're going to be looking at the things the church says and does that are embarrassing, confusing, or even downright offensive. In other religious contexts, your questions might be forbidden, but not here. So whether you're a lifelong churchgoer with the scars to prove it, or you've never entered a church and are just interested in the debate, this is a safe space for you. In that spirit, we're diving headlong into questions of sex and relationships, covering topics from marriage and purity to sexuality and masturbation. We'll also be looking at issues of gender, abuse, and identity, so listener discretion is advised. Please look after yourselves. In today's episode, we're looking at the history of marriage in the West throughout the 2 millennia since Jesus walked the earth. Has marriage always been the church's thing? When did marrying for love get so popular? And what is common law marriage all about? I'm Tim Woodson, and today I'm joined by practical theologian Simon Hall and poet, former social worker and daughter of Simon, Rachel Hall. So last week we heard about how marriage in the Bible isn't really a thing in the way that it's kind of talked about being a thing. So there isn't really a biblical doctrine of marriage. So the question then is, if there isn't a biblical doctrine of marriage, where did that idea come from? And luckily, we've got Simon, who's apparently done a bit of thinking about this.
And is married.
So he knows what he's talking about.
And I have married people.
Yep.
I've married my wife.
Yes.
And as a minister, I have married other people too.
Yeah.
In a different way.
Yeah. Okay. So you might say you're an expert on marriage.
Well, as expert as anyone could be. Although I've only done it once, and that was a long, long time ago. And there's a lot that we would do differently now, I think.
Yeah. Well, like what?
We did a lot of worship songs, all one after the other.
Okay.
And that was probably our way of telling our friends that weren't Christians that we wanted them to be Christians.
Right, yeah. I guess the question is, has it always been like that?
Well, no, funnily enough. Certainly our idea of marriage and the way that you meet someone and court and get married, all the kind of processes that you get to marriage are relatively modern, and I guess modern would be the right word. They're still being worked out when Jane Austen is writing. She's railing against a much more formal, businesslike approach to marriage, and she wants something that we nowadays would call love marriage. But that's only she only died a couple of hundred years ago, and that's still emerging. So that means for 1800 years of the Christian age, it wasn't like that. It sort of emerged very, very slowly over hundreds and hundreds of years.
So hang on. So Jane Austen invented love?
Well, obviously. Rachel, you'd probably agree with that, wouldn't you?
I might have to agree with that, yeah.
Well, people have always fancied each other, and then, one thing leads to another. Before the 1960s, a baby would very, very often result from that.
Right.
I'm not saying that there was no love, but love and sex and marriage and procreation and child rearing were all kind of mixed up together with kind of land ownership and property and the passing on of a family. And love was possibly the bottom or one of the bottom things on that list. It was lovely if you loved your spouse, but it really wasn't necessary.
Right. Should we go back to the beginning then? So let's think you're a new Christian. You've just heard about this thing called Christ, who's rocked up in first century Palestine and has had a nice time for about 3 years, and then had a horrible time for 3 days, and then has kind of gone off to live his reward. And you've gone, I heard what you said during those 3 years, and I thought that's great, so I'm going to do that now. And you find your prospective future partner, you think, they look great, they seem great to me, I could spend more time with them. Am I even in the right ballpark?
Partly, I think. We don't know very much, if I'm honest.
Right.
Because what we have in the scriptures, which Charlotte talked about, is, very, very early stuff in which Paul starts by saying, look, we've got more important things to do because the world's about to end. So if you can get by without having sex is probably better. If you really, really have to get sex, fine, get married,
Right.
Do that thing. But really, we've got to go tell everyone that Jesus is coming back soon.
Yeah.
And slowly that emerges into a more domesticated life.
Yeah.
The virtues of being together and raising children and teaching them to be good. It's common sense in some ways. And when we see people in the 1st and 2nd centuries writing about Christians, we have a few letters from like Roman governors and things writing back to the emperor and saying, what do we do about these Christians? Their family practices and their sexual practices don't get any comment.
Right.
There's this thing that it's this crazy cult where lots of people are becoming Christians. The thing that annoys them is these people care. They don't just care for their own poor, they care for other people's poor. And they refuse to fight in the Roman army, which is a big no-no. So beyond the scriptures, we don't actually know very much, because nobody really comments on the Christians living differently. So we imagine that there would have been marriages, children, fairly stable family life, which in those days would have primarily been about people in different social classes finding, what we would these days call an arranged marriage.
Right.
It's not too far from the world of Jane Austen.
Sure.
As far as I understand it, it wasn't just down to two people meeting down the Colosseum and falling in love.
Yeah. Was a lot of it inherited from, in the case of the Jewish Christians, the Jewish heritage, and then in the case of the more Pauline recent converts, more of a Greek tradition? Was there a merging of traditions, or was there a new tradition formed under Christianity?
Well, that's a great question, which we'll have to cover on another day. Because Christianity, in a sense, was this new cool thing called monotheism, which is like there's this one big God overall. But it was so much easier than Judaism. There were so many less rules, and you didn't have to have your foreskin chopped off.
Great.
Which
Big
is
fan.
always a plus.
Can't relate.
Well, I'm so glad. So there was an element of there are these practices and understandings that are coming out of Judaism. In the New Testament, you hear about these people that were called God-fearers who were Jewish.
Sure.
To use Jonathan Miller's famous phrase, he didn't want to go the whole hog. And Christianity came along and filled that desire for a deeper spirituality and a kind of, an ethic of kind of family life and being a good person that seemed to fit with this kind of growing middle class, I guess, within the Roman Empire.
That's interesting. Yeah.
We've discussed marriage already, but I think it would be good to talk about this kind of idea that we've got at the minute of Christians thinking negatively about sex and kind of where that has sprung from. I wonder what you think about that.
Obviously, we're doing a podcast rather than like an entire church history degree, but a lot of people would say that something went a bit awry in the 5th century.
What happened in the 5th century, Simon?
Well, there was this guy called Augustine. He was from a place called Hippo, which is a great place to come from. He became a bit of a celebrity. He wrote the first really introspective autobiography called The Confessions. He was a big fan of the emperor, and the emperor was a big fan of him, so his writings got promoted. In his Confessions, he writes a lot about his life before he became a Christian, and he had a lot of sexual encounters with different women that he felt that he treated very badly. And on reflection, he felt that he was controlled by his lust.
Right.
That he treated people badly and that he wasn't even in control of himself. So he becomes a Christian and he's filled with kind of shame about how bad he was. And this turns into a theology which hadn't really been around until that point, which is sexual desire is all evil.
Right.
Because your sexual desire is evil, all sex is evil. And that means every human that has ever lived, apart from Adam and Eve, is created through an evil act. So you are, from the moment you're conceived, because you're conceived through something that's evil, you are evil.
So that's the doctrine of original sin.
Yes, yeah. And it comes from a very personal reflection on his own life, but he then universalizes it to this ridiculous degree. and introduces this kind of mutation into the DNA of Christianity, that sex is dirty, sex is always based on something that's wrong with you, your sexual desire is fundamentally sinful or evil. So the result of that is that from there on in, you've got this incredible tension between marriage, which is a way of living together harmoniously and raising children, and yet sex is ultimately problematic. And many hundreds of years later, it results in this weird idea that if you're going to be a priest or a nun or a monk, then you can't get married. You have to be a virgin your whole life, because sex is so evil. You can't possibly be a good Christian and have sex at the same time.
That's really interesting. Did he try and back that up with the Bible or anything like that?
Well, I mean, there is some stuff there in the Bible.
Yeah.
There's a Psalm 51, in which is attributed to David repenting when he'd had this affair with Bathsheba, and he talks about I was sinful from the moment I was conceived. I mean, it's like a proper it's like a Smith song or like an emo. He's really going over the top.
Yeah.
I'm not sure you should make a doctrine from like a really self-pitying poem.
I like the idea that you try and, derive your theological position from, something akin to My Chemical Romance. Or
So the church was kind of teaching that marriage was good, but simultaneously at the same time they're saying that sex is bad, which is obviously leads to a huge amount of confusion.
Yeah, and at this time, marriage was just a thing. Like, I was going to say buying a car, but funnily enough, they didn't have cars in the 5th century.
Buying a horse.
Like buying a horse.
Yeah.
It was a thing that people did. It was a recognised relationship. We don't actually know whether you went to a registry office. There were definitely times in history when people just moved in together and declared themselves married.
Right.
But the point is that the church wasn't doing weddings.
Yeah.
You didn't come to your church to get married. You went to the secular authorities, or your relationship was recognized by the secular authorities, the regular government, or just the society. People were put together. There was a big party, but the church didn't have anything to do with it. So it's not even that the church had a really positive view of marriage and a bad view of sex. At that point in history, marriage was at arm's length. It was something that people in the church did, but it wasn't something that they did under God with their community.
Right, so there was none of this. You wouldn't have a ceremony where people would pray and sing Matt Redman songs at you and and hope that everyone else leaves feeling a sense of unexplainable warmth.
There were ceremonies,
right,
but not marriage ceremonies. That's one of the amazing things. So in this time, 800 CE, it's not that there weren't ceremonies. Christians love ceremonies.
We do.
They've always loved a good ritual. There was things like, there was plighting your troth, which is, like making a promise.
Hence betrothal.
Right. Which we might talk about later as well. But some of the ones that we have are same-sex betrothals, where two men or two women make a promise for a lifelong friendship. There's no evidence that these relationships were sexual, but these came before the church did marriages.
Hang on. So I guess what you're saying, that you're not saying that there was a sort of wholehearted acceptance and celebration of same-sex relationships in the way that we maybe understand them now, but there was at the very least not the same level of revulsion.
No, because I don't think people lived in this sort of atomized way that you have this one partner and all other relationships are subject to that one relationship, which is, traditionally a heterosexual relationship. Right. You've got the church with this ambivalent relationship with sex, and therefore a kind of chaste, loving relationship with the same-sex partner might have actually been preferable to a heterosexual relationship. But the thing about what we know about these, there's a very famous relationship between a guy called Simeon, Saint Simeon, who ended up being called the Holy Fool. You can look him up on Google if you want to laugh. He really was a holy fool.
Okay.
He had a 30-year covenanted relationship with another guy called John. The way it's handed down to us is that they talk about being, two souls bonded as one and being like soul brothers, not in a 1970s kind of way, but they kind of passionate intensity of their love for each other is of a kind that nowadays would be reserved for a sexual relationship.
Right. And there's a record of them committing in something like a marriage ceremony.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm interested in why Augustine seemed to win out. Like, why did those ideas then take hold?
Well, I mentioned the year 800, Christmas Day in the year 800 CE. It was a bit like the millennium. People thought that maybe that Jesus was going to come back.
Right.
It was a really, really big thing. The Pope at the time was obviously a consummate politician, and he really sealed the deal that the Roman Emperor Constantine had started, about 350 years, 400 years earlier. And the Pope crowns this guy Charlemagne as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. It's the culmination of all of Augustine's idea that you have a Pope who kind of rules our interior lives.
Right.
And you have an emperor who rules our exterior lives. But in the horse trading, our kind of personal lives become the realm of the church.
Right.
So now how we live inside our home with our families becomes the business of the church. And so marriage from that point on begins to be literally the business of the church.
Yeah.
It didn't happen overnight, but there's this division of power. The church essentially says to the emperor, we'll keep out of your business.
Yeah.
If you look after us, you enforce our teaching if necessary. And at that point, marriage moves out of the secular sphere, the non-religious sphere, and into the religious sphere as part of what the church sees as its business, because it's that personal, apolitical realm as they see it. Obviously, actually, how we order our private lives and our sex lives is intensely political, but that's kind of how the roles were delineated around that time.
So this is the establishment of what we would understand as a state religion.
Yes. And it's really what we have now as the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always been the Roman Church, but this idea of this kind of the magisterium, just that word, that's the word that the Roman Catholic Church uses for its history and tradition and all its authority and power. Well, obviously, majesty is a word that normally gets used for God or a king. But here now, the church has its own magisterium, its own realm that it rules over.
If we're thinking about that kind of move then from secular to the church, where do we think the idea of no sex before marriage comes from? Does it come from that transition?
It wouldn't be true to say that sex before marriage was not a big issue. You'll read in the scriptures that certainly for the Jews it was a really big deal. But you're talking about people getting married at like 13, 14. You're also talking about women very much seen as the property of men. Your daughter, 12, 13-year-old daughter, having sex is a violation against the father, not a violation of the girl. She is handed over to another man as her husband and her ruler. Adultery was the big thing because that's an offence against the husband's rights on the body of the woman.
Right.
That's the big thing, because there just wasn't much opportunity for premarital sex.
I started off talking about, this idea of a mutual commitment kind of thing, which is the way we understand it now. But I guess what we're saying here is that that's never really been a reality until very, very recently.
Yeah, I think that's fair. You can read the New Testament, you can read the life of Jesus as beginning to open up equality, but it really is just the beginning.
Yeah.
Most of Jesus's teaching about sex, such as it is made to men.
Yeah.
There were women in his entourage, but there are no women in his disciples. There is still a massive imbalance. And I think that we can set a trajectory towards women's liberation and towards gender equality, but it's not there at the time, and it's taken 2,000 years for us to get there, very, very slowly, sometimes going backwards.
And to be clear, in almost no culture throughout time has marriage ever been a partnership of equals. Is that fair to say? Or I think that's, it's probably difficult to substantiate that, but I think we are going to talk about that.
Yeah, it would be great to talk about that. And I'm sure there are amazing one-off relationships. And actually, when the Song of Songs is, it's about a man coming to a woman, but the desire and the enjoyment is equal in both of them. In Song of Songs, sex is not something being done by a man to a woman as a passive recipient.
Yeah, that's pretty clear.
But in the social context, which is, as I say, for the first 800 years, it's not a religious context. Property and all kind of inheritance goes through men. For a lot of that time, women can't own property at all. If they're going to inherit anything from their father, they need to get married first so that their father can give it to their husband.
So I guess what we're saying then is that if that's always been the case throughout certainly Jewish history and the Roman Empire at large, then what's happening at this 800 CE period is this being formalized into law, I guess.
Yes.
The beginnings of that, anyway.
I'm not an expert on Roman Catholic history, but obviously they do have a strong notion of this great tradition, which is like the tradition of a country, of constitution and laws and all of that. So yeah, it begins to be kind of codified.
Yeah.
If you're baptizing infants and you're marrying adults and then baptizing their children and burying them when they die, then you're totally integrated into the fabric of society, especially if you have a monopoly on those kind of activities.
I guess in terms of thinking about marriage then, people didn't always get married at 13, 14. So how did the church deal with marriage when people started getting married later, when they were older?
That's a really good question, because society changes and the church sometimes has to work out its response as things are happening, which is, the situation we're in now when society is changing really, really quickly. So in the time that we tend to study history, like I did, the Tudors at school, that period when you start thinking about Henry VIII and all of his wives, and clearly something's going on there. In the times after that, getting married was so important that you really wanted it to get it right. We know a lot more about wealthier people because they keep records and they write letters. And when wealthier people were all about children, I mentioned Henry VIII, he got married several times because he wanted a male heir. Because a male heir ideally would carry on your name and your legacy. A marriage for both parties was really, really important. Over the centuries, alongside what you read in literature where people just get married, there was also this idea of betrothal, we've mentioned that word already, which would be similar to engagement in different times. We're talking sort of 16th, 17th, 18th, into the 19th century. People would be betrothed, and this is a bit of an exaggeration, but you would call it a kind of trial marriage. At this time, having children is still absolutely central to what marriage is about. And so you might be betrothed for a year or longer. If a child was conceived, then that was kind of it. You were then married. But if a child wasn't conceived, then there was the possibility of breaking it off. These two people are not compatible, then they haven't made a baby. There are definitely other reasons why people might break it off. So this is not something that we know very much about. I don't know why people don't talk about it, but we do know, for example, that in the early years of the colonization of the Americas, that those folk, many of whom were very committed Christians, non-conforming Christians admittedly, Quakers and Baptists and folk who were being persecuted in Britain, they did have this practice of betrothal. That's well recorded as far as I can see, that it's not the same as just living together because you want to live together, because it's a trial marriage. The assumption is that you probably are going to get married at the end of it unless something goes really seriously wrong. But technically, that was sex before marriage.
It's interesting that having a child is the signifier for that going well.
That's something that's really hard for us to relate to, because now for us, having a child is much more of a choice. And if you don't want to have a child, then you don't have to. And if you do want to have a child and you're not physically able to conceive of one, you can still try medical intervention or adopt. So the idea that a child is a kind of sign that you're a compatible couple, it just doesn't compute with us. And that's one of the societal changes that we're going through at the moment, this kind of disconnection between sex and love and marriage and children. Children becomes an optional extra. So you have to find a way to define marriage that doesn't involve children.
And I suppose when you're thinking about sex as well, you know, the Bible very clearly talks about sex being a means to be fruitful and procreate. But obviously, as you're saying, you don't necessarily need sex to have a child in our culture today. So actually the idea that we've got of sex, the purpose of it being for children, we don't look at it like that anymore because we have contraception and IVF, and it doesn't look as it was intended to anymore, which I think is interesting.
And I guess because, like, if you had sex any point up until the sort of middle of the 20th century, if you had sex at any point, then there is a likelihood that at some point you're going to conceive and there's going to be a baby involved. And there are no safe methods of abortion at that point. So the idea is that you're going to have a child. So I guess I can understand there being a moral imperative to regard that with a level of responsibility. Whether or not that equates to a sort of ritual purity, which I think is kind of how it's talked about now, is maybe different. But I guess I can understand that to an extent.
Yeah, we'll talk more about this idea of ritual purity, which is definitely there in parts of the Old Testament, maybe a bit in the New Testament, but it's definitely not a weapon that the church has. I mean, yes, a woman's virginity is a very prized thing, and that is handed from one man to another. But actually, when the church talks about sex, it is very much around this sort of duty to raise children, and as Rachel says, it's feeding off that biblical injunction to go forth and multiply, that's our responsibility. And of course, if you have sex without contraception, there's a very, very good chance that you will indeed go forth and multiply. So now we talk about pleasure and we talk about self-fulfillment and all of that. There's much more of a sense of the duty to your family, to be respectable, to carry on the family name and the family values, and to raise the next generation of the family. The world we live in now, I don't think the church has really yet found an adequate way to respond. The Catholic Church's position on contraception is at least consistent historically.
Right.
In the sense of, no, you get married to have children and to raise those children. That's what marriage is for. The Church of England has sort of just let contraception slide by without really working out what it thinks about it. If you go to a Church of England ceremony, it will still say at the beginning of the service that the point of marriage is to have children, although I think there are now forms of that service where that gets scrubbed out. But they haven't actually had a big conversation about the meaning of sex and marriage and loving relationships which don't make babies until now, when they're suddenly, at least some folk, get upset about same-sex marriage. And it's like, oh, well, it's not a real marriage unless you make babies. And it's like, well, no, you let that one slide 60 years ago. You didn't do anything about contraception, so you've already undermined your argument. You let lots of people get married who have no intention of having kids.
So I guess what are the ways that marriage was thought of throughout the Middle Ages?
It was messy. This idea that I might have given that in 799 CE, people just got married, and then in 800 CE, the church sort of took over everything, the way that like the NHS was set up overnight.
Sure.
After World War II. It was complicated, and obviously not everyone was a Christian, and not everyone was the right kind of Christian. And obviously then you get to the Reformation and things fracture massively.
The Reformation being the schism.
This was the point at which you might have heard of a guy called Martin Luther. He basically says the Roman Catholic Church has become corrupt. I think even most Roman Catholics would agree that was true. And he basically said, we need a reformation of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church said, no, thank you. And so groups started to split off. And by this time, control of marriage became a way of including and excluding people.
Right, okay.
And if you couldn't get legally married, well, that can be a big problem. It's not that the Roman Catholic Church were especially bad at that. Later on in England, when the Church of England had the same control over marriage, then they tried to exclude any sort of dissenting groups. I'm a Baptist minister. The earliest Baptists, they were persecuted. Some of them were locked up. They weren't burnt at the stake, but various things were done to keep them on the fringes of society. You know, they had to build their chapels a mile away from like the nearest village. One of the ways of excluding Baptists was you can't get married.
Right.
You can't, because you have to be an Anglican to get married.
Yeah.
To begin with, the courts were sympathetic, and most people in this country have heard of the idea of common law marriage. So people that weren't allowed to get married in the Church of England, their relationship was still recognised in law, even though they hadn't gone through any kind of legal process. I love talking to my Baptist fellows, brothers and sisters and siblings, about the fact that the earliest Baptists didn't get married. They didn't get legally married because they weren't allowed to. Things got so fractious that in the 18th century, there was a Marriage Act that basically said, oh, we're not having that.
Right.
You can't have a common law marriage. Either you are married or you aren't.
Right.
Again, at this point, it's not about protecting the rights of the woman. It's about protecting property rights. You know, if you're legally married, it's clear who owns what.
Yeah.
So they're obviously more important.
Obviously more important. So in 1753, there was a kind of compromise in the sense that the Church of England, we do all the marriages.
Right.
But you dissenters and nonconformists, we'll let you get married, but we're still the ones controlling the marriage. You don't have to recant your faith to get married. And if you're a Jew or a Quaker, weirdly, you can have your own services. So nothing for Muslims or people of other faiths at that time. For a long, long time, those were like the three groups that could conduct weddings: Anglicans, Jews, and Quakers. And then about 100 years later, it liberalises a bit more, and you start to have marriages in a registry office. So it slowly changes and develops, but it's not until the middle of the 19th century that you can have a non-religious marriage. So in England.
So for about 400 years, that is then, that you basically had to be a particular type of Christian to get married.
Yes. And the Church of England didn't like this idea of common law marriage.
Yeah.
Which were people who didn't get married. So lots and lots of Christians didn't get married.
Right.
But they called it common law marriage because they were committed to each other.
Yeah.
They lived together. And the Church of England was like, right, we're not having that. You all come to us.
Did they do their own things then? Like today, like you just have a little blessing?
Yeah, I'm sure they did. I'm not saying people just lived together or there was serial monogamy. That wouldn't be an accurate description of it.
No, but I think there's something to say about what the church's opinion on people that get married but that aren't religious and don't have a faith. Like, do they see that marriage as worthy? I think it's important to consider what we say about those partnerships and those marriages, whether, you know, if they're not done under God, are they worth anything?
Yeah. And I think there is a good discussion to be had about the notion of common law marriage, because the idea of punishing people who have been living together for a long time, who have, you know, had a good, loving, faithful relationship, who care about each other, raise kids, and then one of them dies and their partner doesn't have any legal rights because they haven't had a legal marriage. I find that problematic. I think you're right, Rach, that we should commend people who have, you know, good relationships, even if they're not in quite the shape that we think that they should be in.
We're kind of veering in towards the Jane Austen period.
Yeah.
I certainly think the view of marriage I inherited, I see a lot in that, particularly going into that Victorian understanding. Do you think there was a shift in that period?
I think definitely. It's really difficult for us to see the world on the other side of the Victorian period, because it's not just that you've got huge social movements, you've got literal movements of people. You've got the Industrial Revolution. You've got, up to that point, was the biggest societal upheaval certainly in Britain. And you've got people moving to different parts of the country, moving to cities and reinventing themselves in new ways. And so those ties to the land and to the aristocracy and the traditional ways of doing marriage and handing over property and land, that breaks. Especially, we haven't talked much about working people, but they're now completely free of the kind of medieval tie to the land.
Yeah.
But then instead they are enslaved to the factory. It's not a massive improvement, but there's no tradition. There's no system telling them how to live. They are really, really reinventing themselves.
It's a move from a monarchist system to a capitalist.
Yeah. By that time, it's not fair to sort of see it as feudal, but it's definitely the last gasp of that place of everyone knowing their position in society, and no one gets out of that. Suddenly you've got middle-class people becoming insanely wealthy and therefore powerful. People are moving up and down the social structures in a way that hasn't really happened before.
So these ideas that are talked about in Austen's world become more accessible. So the people reading them as time goes on, it's more plausible that they can read themselves into those. So, I mean, they can read for a start.
Well, yeah. And so, like I said earlier, the idea of marrying for love is a sort of sweet, naive thing that a woman like Jane Austen, who never married, could write about. But the reality was you needed to marry someone wealthy. And if you're marrying a woman, she needed to produce children. There were clear practical requirements that were more important than love. Now you have all these younger working people moving into cities, making their own decisions. You've got the rise of Methodism, which is a very kind of passionate version of Christianity. Around that time, you've got a Scottish evangelist called Henry Drummond who writes this pamphlet. This was the era of pamphlets,
Yeah, every piece of music was composed with an accompanying manifesto.
And he wrote this pamphlet called The Greatest Thing in the World.
Oh.
That's a great title.
Yeah.
He writes about Paul's famous sort of poem about love in his letter to the Corinthians. Love is patient, love is kind. And for the first time, really, he talks about not that as a kind of generic way of being a good person, because in the traditional translation of the Bible, the word is translated as charity to mean a sort of special religious kind of love. But he says, no, this is how a husband and wife should love each other.
Right.
And suddenly, in the middle of this explosion, you've got a new way of understanding. It's hard to explain how big this pamphlet was. Reprinted hundreds of times, went all around the world. It seems weird to us who've been to dozens and dozens of weddings where this passage is read. It's just inane now. It's kind of meaningless. But this idea that in a marriage, this Christ-like sacrificial love was meant to be how a husband loved his wife. This was a kind of revolutionary thing, and it created a new model for what marriage was when it was disconnected from property and family and duty.
Interesting.
This is like, you are going into this thing to love another person the way that Jesus loves. I'm not saying it's a completely new idea. At that time, in a sort of social upheaval, this contributes to the idea of marriage that we have now, which is really, it's just about two people who love each other very much. Your parents aren't really that involved. Your property's not really that involved. You might have a joint bank account. But even that is, it is all about love. Initially romantic love, but then maturing into something more giving and self-decentering rather than self-centered love.
I think that's good, because that is one of the things that I value most about marriage and the marriage ideal. And, it's one of the things that sold me on it, is the idea of committing to somebody in a way that goes beyond the purely transactional or, the merely comfortable. So I think it's interesting to hear that that's where this idea began, because it does feel, again, like one of those things that's maybe a universally understood thing about marriage, that we look back at history of marriage with that view of this interconnectedness. And so I think it's really interesting to hear that that's a relatively recent idea.
Yeah, obviously there have been people who have fallen in love. We are biologically programmed to fall madly and passionately in love with someone for at least long enough to make a baby.
Right.
But you know, the hormones that are released in our bodies are meant to bond us to that other person, not just for a few minutes, but for long enough that we raise our offspring together.
Yeah.
It's not that Drummond created something completely new. It's there in the New Testament.
Yeah.
You know, Paul says, husbands, you should love your wives as Christ loved the church. But what happens is that love rises right to the top of the list, almost to the neglect of any sense of you live in a society. Your marriage is actually part of the way that this society works. Your commitment to each other is actually a social good. And now it's a point where it's who cares? It's me and you against the world.
Right. Maybe more reflection on that. There is a sort of hyper-individualistic view. And it does feel a little bit like within church community that it does maintain its communal sense, I think. Certainly the wedding ceremonies I've gone to, it definitely feels like it's not just for the couple.
I think like outside of church community, we don't see community prioritized in the same way at all. I think what you were talking about, Tim, about that kind of self-centered thinking, I think a lot of people my age think like that. We don't think about other people before we think about what we want to do. That's the thing that's lost, I think, in terms of thinking about actually what can we gain from being in community with other people. You know, actually how can our relationships thrive when they happen in community with other people. And I think without being in a church kind of atmosphere, you fail to think like that, and you do just think, well, this is my relationship and it impacts just me and just that other person. But you know, that's not true. Any relationship that we have with other people is going to undoubtedly impact other people around us.
Some of the people I really valued in church are the ones who you could tell that they had this really strong foundation in their relationship and in their marriage, that out of that they would then offer quite generously. One of the things that I would hope would remain part of our view of marriage, I think. How do we broaden it beyond marriage? I think one of the things that we're going to cover is maybe this idea that marriage it's one way of doing things, and when we think it's a good way of doing things, but it's certainly not the only way of doing things. And how do we use that model and think about it in the broadest sense? Rachel, have you got any thoughts?
I think the thing that's standing out to me is marriage was largely insignificant for those kind of first 800 years, and then they sort of seemingly decided to care about it. And I think the conversations that I have with my friends is that church has such an authority over marriage now, and what the right kind of marriage to have is, and what you should do leading up to marriage, and that feels very kind of common knowledge to us when we, you know, when I move in those kind of Christian circles. I think it's interesting that, you know, that hasn't always been the case.
This like idea that the church defines what marriage is.
Yeah, and actually there was a period of time where that didn't happen, and actually people didn't care about that as much. And, you know, this idea of that common law marriage, or those kind of bonding relationships that people that were of the same sex had, you know, actually all of those variations existed as they exist now, and it looks slightly different. But actually the church hasn't always been the thing to regulate that, and the church hasn't always been the thing to say, well that's a worthy partnership, that's a worthy relationship. And obviously, as we talked about, that happened in the secular sphere then, and it is happening now. And I think it just removes, for me in my brain, the church kind of being the singular umbrella of how we determine marriage and kind of what worthy relationships are.
Yeah, I'm really struck by the motivations that we've kind of covered in church, because I think I felt very strongly this feeling of growing up in church that marriage was the ideal. That's what you're aiming for. That's the prize. That's the goal. And feeling like the church seems to have this dominance, this authority on that vision, that particular vision of marriage. You know, like it's in your head, you imagine every sort of feel-good family film from the 80s and 90s would center on like a good Christian married couple with like 3 blonde kids, and but like feeling like that, well, that's what I had to go for, and if I don't get that, or if that's not what I want, then I'm doing it wrong. But like even worse, that I'm like doing faith wrong, or I'm not pursuing God the way that I ought to. And that's even before we start to interrogate the element that it was used as a means of control, as a means of reinforcing the gender dynamic of keeping women in their place. All of these things which we've not quite shaken, and we've perhaps romanticized a few of them. It's a real interesting thing to talk to engaged couples about, whether they're going to submit, whether the wife is going to submit or not, because some people are, I remember talking to one person who was basically, almost like as a dare. They were like, oh, maybe I'm going to say obey, but like as a dare, because they felt it like
a bit like those people that voted Brexit for a joke.
Right.
I think the thing that comes from it is like there's a sense of failing. Like you can fail at this faith thing. You can fail at this Christian thing. If you do not do this thing in this order, in this way, you do not say that thing. If you don't say obey, you don't say submit, that isn't the perfect version of this that we want for you. And if you don't have that shiny version of a relationship or of a marriage, you have failed.
I think that just talking about this, which I've never really done in such a sort of coherent way before, the thing that has struck me was, to this day, you will hear church people say, well, marriage, that's our thing.
Right.
God invented it. We control it. We let state authorities do it. But really, marriage is our thing, which historically just isn't true. If in 800 CE, Charlemagne had said, well, look, you can have business contracts and I'll keep marriage, it would have been just as weird. And then history, oh, no, you can't buy a car without coming to the church to sign that contract. Oh yeah, God invented business. Yeah. So we're the only people that can tell you what a good business deal is. Yeah. It's a funny historical anomaly when you know that the church really wasn't that interested for 800 years. It doesn't mean that they didn't have anything to say about what a good relationship was and what the point of it was. Relationships are what makes us human, whether you go back to Adam and Eve or you go back 6 million years, people were in committed relationships before there was religion, before anyone even uttered the word God. People were in committed relationships. So in that sense, marriage is a natural thing. It's the way that humans have ordered themselves. And it's absolutely legitimate for Christians to have something to say about what God thinks about how we should arrange our relationships. It's just a weird thing that Christians would say, oh yeah, we rule marriage. It's our thing, when it clearly isn't.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. Episodes are released every other Monday, and next up is our Q&A episode on Monday, 8th of December. If you'd like to ask us about anything Simon's covered in this episode, or anything else from the series so far, please get your questions to us by Friday 28th of November to feature. You can message us at agodwecouldbelievin@gmail.com or via our socials. Lastly, a reminder, if you'd like to support the project, make sure you share it with your friends or family, and you can patronise us by subscribing to agodwecouldbelievin.substack.com. Here you'll also receive bonus episodes and regular reflections from Simon and the team right to your inbox. We'll see you again very soon.